Televiziunea Română, întâlnirile JTI și Fundația Art Production vă recomandă Garantat 100%.
Salutare, bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitata noastră de astăzi este scriitoare, eseistă, activistă pentru drepturile femeilor, o personalitate foarte apreciată în întreaga lume. Cărțile sale au fost traduse în 53 de limbi. Volumele în limba română ale invitatei noastre au fost publicate la editura Polirom. Sunt volume pe care le recomand cu toată căldura. Mulțumim Institutului Cultural Român de la Londra pentru obținerea acestui interviu. Doamnelor și domnilor, e o onoare să-i spunem bun venit la Garantat 100% scriitoarei Elif Shafak. Elif Shafak, hello, thank you so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start by asking you a few things about some of your characters in Jamila, Pembe, Adem and Iskender from the novel Honor, about Asya and Armanush from The Bastard of Istanbul, from Peri, from the three daughters of Eve, the whole human universe in The Flea Palace, Rumi, Shams and Ella in The 40 Rules of Love, and there are many more. There's a continuous interior, sometimes boiling movement in between faith and doubt. Doubt is never comfortable. But is faith comfortable? What do you think about that?
Thank you so much. It's such a great question. I think I don't like certainty, people who are very sure of their own truths. That makes me uncomfortable. So when I see someone who's extremely confident of his or her religiosity, I want to be able to ask them, don't you have any doubt? And equally, when I meet someone who is extremely confident of their atheism, I want to ask them, don't you have any, a speck of faith? I think I don't feel close to absolutisms of any kind. What is more interesting for me is the dance of faith and doubt. I want them to question each other. Faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are very, very dangerous. So doubt is precious, and I respect doubt, and I think we should always have doubts about ourselves, keep questioning. But at the same time, there are elements of faith in our lives that are secular, not necessarily religious. When you start writing a book, it's an act of faith. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know where the story is going to take you. When you move to another city or to another country, it's an act of faith. When you fall in love, you don't know if that person is the right person for you, but you follow this weird intuition. It's an act of faith. Absolutely. So there are secular pockets of faith that I think the left liberals have failed to talk about in general. And I think I feel closer to the dance of faith and doubt, who was very familiar to the mystics. The mystics were very familiar to this. Also agnostics. There's a humility in agnosticism. You can say, I don't know. I think we forgot to say, I don't know as human beings. So I'd rather not be sure. I'd rather keep searching. And I'd rather faith and doubt talk to each other and challenge each other.
But some people feel very uncomfortable when they feel the doubt, when they feel they don't know. They prefer to know. People prefer certainties.
Because it makes them feel more safe. But I think it's a superficial sense of safety. In reality, you can't know, And it's to me, it's healthier to accept the things we don't know. It makes us more humble. I like that kind of humility, which is important in the age of information, because we're living in an age in which information seemingly has become free and accessible, very easy to reach. There's a bombardment of information in our lives. That doesn't necessarily make us knowledgeable. I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think they're completely different things. We have way too much information in our world, very little knowledge and even less wisdom. So we need to change the ratio. We need less information, because too much information makes us arrogant, gives us the impression that we know things, when in fact we haven't gone in depth, you know. So we need less information. We need more knowledge. For that, we need books. We need investigative journalism. We need to slow down, you know, take a breath, just slow down. Ultimately, we need wisdom. For that, we need emotional intelligence, empathy, stories. We need to bring the mind and the heart together.
If you're talking about slowing down, here's a quotation. Cities are erected on their spiritual columns. Like giant mirrors, they reflect the hearts of their residents. End of quotation. This is you from the 40 Rules of Love. How are the giant mirrors of London, and how are the giant mirrors of Istanbul, if you compare them?
Beautiful questions. It's complicated, and I think this moment in time, as we're going through this pandemic that is taking lives, that is exposing the existing inequalities. The pandemic didn't cause the inequalities, but it made them more clear, more visible. We need to talk about so many injustices, inequalities. Right now, many cities are going through transformation. The world is going through a transformation. And I think we're at a crossroads. But here's something I find important. Memory is important. Memory is a responsibility. And not in order to get stuck in the past, but to learn from the past and hopefully never ever to make the same mistakes. A city like Istanbul is a city with a rich history, but that doesn't mean we have a strong memory. In fact, I think in Turkey, we are a society of collective amnesia. Istanbul is a city of urban amnesia. You walk by an amazing historic building. There are no placards, no signs, no knowledge of what happened there. You know, who lived on that street? Where did they go? We know nothing. We lost our curiosity for the past. London, compared to Istanbul, has more visible urban memory, but they're both places in which I see lots of things changing. It's a time of transformation across the world.
Elif Shafak, what's your understanding of feminism? Obviously, you're very familiar with the fact that the more you travel to the eastern parts of Europe and the farther away to Asia, the skepticism and the rejection towards this word, they become bigger and bigger. How will you define feminism for a skeptical he or she, regardless of the place they come from?
Yes, I find this question very important. And unfortunately, sometimes people in the West, feminists in the West, do not understand that it's difficult to carry the word. When I go to different parts of the world, people don't like the word. I use the word sisterhood, for instance, and then I realize sisterhood, people embrace it more lovingly. Many people think of feminism as a Western concept, as a Western phenomenon, but in reality, it is not. And when you look at each and every country, including Turkey, going all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, around the same time that there was a feminist movement in the Western world, there were feminist groups. Some of them, of course, they didn't call themselves as such, but they believed in gender equality. There were women and men who believed in equality in the late 19th, mid-19th century. So actually, historically speaking, in each and every country, from Egypt to the Balkans, from Anatolia to Asia, equality is a universal cry. It's not the domain of any culture, any civilization. Justice is a universal cry. Wherever there's an injustice, this could be racial, this could be ethnic, this could be gender or class inequality, I think it's very understandable that people say, wait a second, we need to fix this broken system. We need to pay attention to the inequalities. Women compose half of the population across the world. And yet, when you look at the people who make the decisions, when you look at the power structure in many countries, women are not there. Women are always ruled, and especially where I come from, which is a very patriarchal, very homophobic society. Turkey is a very sexist society, and unfortunately it has increased, which is not a coincidence, because when countries go backwards, when democracy is broken, when countries become more ultranationalist, more Islamist, or religious fundamentalism takes hold, and when populism and populist authoritarianism increases, misogyny also increases, patriarchy also increases. They always go hand in hand. So we have a long way to go as citizens of the world. If we believe in equality, justice, democracy, I think we should all embrace the term sisterhood and feminism.
Since you're talking about that, let me remind you the year 2006. You published The Bastard of Istanbul, and you were put to trial for something which is called insulting Turkishness. What's that insulting Turkishness?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows what insulting Turkishness means. It's so vague, and because it's so vague, it's open to interpretation. It's open to misinterpretation. But basically, this is an article in our constitution.
301.
301, which has been used against journalists, historians who have especially asked questions about our history. This happened many times, but it was the first time that the same article was used against a work of fiction, against a novel. When my novel came out, I was put on trial, and the lines from the book were taken out, used as evidence in the courtroom, which was very surreal because my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters. This is a book that talks about memory and amnesia, and it talks about our history through the eyes of women, and it does talk about the Armenian genocide.
Let me please underline this in order to understand the surrealism of the situation. So a real lawyer is defending a real writer, but also fictional characters in a trial in a court of law.
Yes, because he has to, because those are the lines that were used as evidence. So at the end, this lasted for about a year. And at the end of that year, I was acquitted and the fictional characters were acquitted. But there were groups, nationalist groups on the streets, spitting at my pictures, burning EU flags. And it was a difficult time. Even afterwards, I had to live with a bodyguard for about a year and a half for writing a novel. So Turkey is a difficult place for writers in that regard.
I would kindly ask you to explain our viewers, why did you need the help of a bodyguard since you were acquitted?
Yes, because of all that ultranationalism, within the society, because it's not only the authorities, but ultranationalist groups and this entire ideology. What is difficult is, let me put it this way, every nation state has its official narrative. In that regard, countries are very similar, there's not much of a difference between, France has its own official version, you would say Denmark has its own official version, Italy has, and so on. But what makes a difference is between a democracy and a non-democracy. In a democracy, you can walk into a bookstore, you can easily find books that question the official narrative and say, wait a second, you forgot to include this history, you forgot to include that story. And the writers of those books are not incarcerated. The writers of those books are not put on trial. In a democracy, you can find journalists who ask questions about the official narrative. So there's an open space. In a non-democracy, you can't find this. Just one narrative dominates the entire society or tries to dominate it. So in a non-democracy, if you question the official narrative, people can easily say, oh, he's a traitor, or she's a betrayer. And nationalism in that regard runs very deep in Turkey.
Elif Shafak, you're a very open person. So may I play the role of the devil's advocate? Will you accept that?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not only about conservatives, but sometimes even about people without any specific ideology, people that would tell you something like this. You're in the West right now. Why do you care for what's in the East? Why do you and others stir those guys from the East? It's their culture you interfere in. Why do you want to change that? It's a way of life, and the majority out there fully embraces it. What gives you the right to ask those societies to change their way of life? Can you please answer that?
Yes, and I respect this question. I believe in multiple belongings. I am Turkish. This is also my country, you know. I am an Istanbulite. Whether I live in Istanbul or not, Istanbul is in me. I carry it with me wherever I go. And I think anyone who reads my books will see that there's so much love and emotional attachment for the culture, the people, the minorities. So whether you live in exile or whether you live there, it doesn't matter. What really matters is, do you have that belonging? Do you have that emotional attachment in your soul? And that is something no authoritarian regime can change. And the second thing is, when we talk about societies, we hear the voices of the majority too much, but we never hear the voices of minorities. And in fact, when you look under the surface, there are so many people who feel voiceless. Because there's no full freedom of speech, their voices are not in the public space. But there are all these people who feel hurt or broken. I, as a writer, of course, I'm interested in stories, but I'm equally interested in silences. Rather than the center, it is the periphery that always attracts my attention. So I want to see the periphery of the Turkish society. Who are the people who are pushed to the periphery? Where are the minorities? Who are the people who feel other? You know, who are the silenced? And what are the untold stories? I think it's the job of a writer. Doesn't matter whether you're an American writer, French writer, or Turkish writer. It's a writer's job to pay attention to the silences and to those who have been silenced. And literature in that regard is an act of resistance. Literature always gives more voice to the voiceless, brings the periphery to the center, and hopefully rehumanizes people who have been dehumanized.
I'll continue to play the devil's advocate, and I'll do it a little bit harder. What would you answer if somebody tells you something like that? You're a good writer, but not such a good writer as you pretend. You take advantage of the crazy, ultra-liberal political times that we live in order to make a literary career out of that. You do more politics than literature. And that's the key to your success. End of a possible quotation.
If you are a writer from a wounded democracy, you do not have the luxury of being non-political. Let's start with that basic premise. If you happen to come from a country like Turkey, Nigeria, Pakistan, Venezuela, the Philippines, and I can go on and on, that list is very long and it's getting longer and longer. You don't have the luxury of saying, you know, I don't want to talk about politics. I only want to talk about my fiction. If so much is happening outside the window, if there's so much suffering outside the window, you need to go and look what's happening outside the window. And if what you see bothers your conscience, you need to speak up. That to me is very essential. But secondly, as a feminist, one of the many wonderful things that I have learned from women's movements of past generations is that politics is not only about parliament or political parties. When you talk about sexuality or gender or day-to-day relations, you might be talking about politics too. Because wherever there is power, there is some kind of politics. So for me, politics is not only about politicians, it's broader than that. But ultimately, as a storyteller, as a novelist, what is precious for me is to ask questions. I want to create open spaces in which we can talk about difficult subjects. I'm not interested in the answers as much as the questions, because the writer's job is not to try to preach or teach or to pass on their own worldview. I don't like that. I find that very off-putting. A writer's job is to ask questions. And then I always leave the answers to the reader, because every reader's answer will be different. And I have to respect that.
You also talk in many interviews about the importance of emotions and about bringing together the emotions with the mind. Lots of people hear only what they want, and you know that, and lots of us, we know that. Sometimes we hear only what we want to. What would you answer if someone tells you, you want an emotional overturn of the world, the tyranny of the darkness of emotions instead of the light of rationality? How would you answer to that?
Beautiful question. I want to honor emotions, but I also want to be honest about how important emotions are in our daily lives. Again, where I come from, people think, well, women are emotional, men are not emotional. That's nonsense. Men or women, East or West, we are emotional creatures as human beings. And there are interesting studies that show what we remember, we mostly remember through emotions. You know, when you look at your past, each and every one of us, the stories that we carry with ourselves, they're always stories where we felt something strong, whether it's hurt or joy or excitement. Emotions matter, especially in today's world in which emotions guide or misguide politics and are shaped by politics in return. As we're going through this pandemic, I see lots of anxiety around. I think we're in the age of anxiety. It's almost like an existential angst. It is the age of anger, fear, confusion, bewilderment. And rather than trying to sweep these emotions under the carpet, I'd rather talk about them and try to see, even if the negative emotions, can we turn them into something more positive for ourselves, but also for our communities. My background is in political science, and in political science in general, emotions are always underestimated because it's not measurable data. It's not quantitative data. And I find that problematic, you know. We need to include the importance of emotions when we analyze societies. But if I may add this, for me, the most dangerous emotion, you know, we can talk about anger, we can talk about fear and all of that, but I can understand all of this. And to a certain extent, I find them very human responses. The only emotion that scares me is the lack of all emotions, which is numbness, apathy, when we become indifferent, disconnected. If the moment I start saying, I don't care, you know, what is it to me? Whether refugees die, you know, in a small boat, small children are dying, the moment we say, I don't care, whether there's human suffering, that kind of numbness, apathy, I think is the most dangerous threshold. And that is the only emotion that scares me.
Mm-hmm. You quoted in an interview the late Zygmunt Bauman and his concept of liquid modernity. What is your personal understanding of the liquid times we live in right now?
For such a long time, there was this perception of the world, dualistic perception, as if some countries were solid, safe, steady, mostly the Western world, and some other countries were regarded as liquid countries, Turkey being one of them. So people thought that you needed to worry about feminism, or let's say women's rights, you needed to worry about human rights, or rule of law, or freedom of speech in those liquid countries. But you didn't have to worry about them in the solid countries, because in the solid countries, democracy had been achieved. That was the perception. After 2016, after Brexit happened, Trump happened, and country after country across Europe, we have seen a rise of populism or some kind of populist nationalism. More and more people came to realize that there is no such thing as solid countries versus liquid countries. We're all living in liquid times. That's why I love Zygmunt Bauman's quote and his analysis so much, because he saw it so early on. And in liquid times, everything is shifting. Suddenly nothing feels solid anymore, which is an amazing potential for change, but also a scary time because it enables demagogues to enter the picture and say, don't worry, you know, don't be scared of complexity, just leave it to me. I'm going to simplify things for you. So this is the age of demagogues, and I think we should be very much aware of that.
You also talk in many occasions about cultural bridges between East and West. The cultural bridge is possible. By the way, is it?
I think it is possible. Of course it is possible, because look, here we are. We understand each other. Sometimes we disagree. We communicate through a digital platform, despite the fact that we were born into such seemingly different cultures on the surface, and yet we have so many common elements. I think when you speak with people, when you connect with young people, women, minorities, young men, you know, people of all backgrounds, it's amazing to see that humanity, the humanism, the core, that is never taught to us, unfortunately, in the age of populism. In the age of populism, we're always told that we have singular identities. If I describe myself as a singular identity, if you do the same, we will probably clash. But if I realize that I have multiple belongings, so yes, I'm an Istanbulite, I'm attached to the Balkans, you know, put me next to a Romanian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Greek author, I have so much in common. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East. I am a European by birth, you know, the values that I share. Over the years, I became a Londoner, a British citizen, and despite what politicians, because of Brexit, have been telling us in the UK, I want to call myself a citizen of the world, a citizen of humanity. That doesn't mean you're floating in the air aimlessly. It means you have multiple attachments. If we all look at our own multiple attachments, there's a bigger chance that we can find what we have in common.
The devil's advocate is back. You talk about fluids, about multiple belongings. People feel very safe inside what they think that's their identity. Why would you want to take them out of there?
I'm not challenging people's identity. What I'm challenging is that is our starting point. It cannot be where we end up. Of course, to start with our identity, with our ancestors' journeys, I'm a storyteller. I chase those stories and I treasure those stories. But what I'm saying is life is a journey. Rather than going into a box and staying in that box year after year after year, starting with an identity, but expanding. And also, sometimes populists say, well, if you are a traveler, if you're an elite, if you're international, of course you can have multiple belongings. But if you're born and raised in the same town, you know, you don't have multiple belongings. That is wrong. That is not true. Maybe you were born in the same village or town and built your own family there. You still have multiple belongings, because whether it's your sports affiliations, cultural affiliations, the stories of your own ancestors when you go back centuries, it could be a sexual orientation or identity, and many other layers that I might not be able to see when I look at that person, but I'm just trying to say we all have multiple layers. A human being, every human being is complex, is complicated, and that's the beauty of it. Nationalism, tribalism, populism disregards multiplicity and pretends we are monoliths. It doesn't do that only to human beings, it does it to societies. And this is why a populist demagogue can say, my society is a monolith and I represent a society. So if you question me, you're against the entire society. That kind of identification is very wrong. So all I'm trying to say is multiplicity, diversity. These are important values worth defending in our age.
I know that you do this in your books and you do it always, but let me challenge you yourself now. I mean, what do you do in a conversation with a real believer that will tell you, don't talk to me about multiple belongings. Don't talk to me about complexity. There's a single entity, and this is God. The other voices are the voices of the devil. You are a voice of the devil. How would you answer to that?
That's very harsh, you know.
But you got that. You got those questions. You got those situations.
Yes, I find that very harsh, and also I would be very wary, cautious of anyone who claims they know the voice of God and who claims they own the voice of God. What kind of arrogance is that? Who represents the voice of God? being in a certain status, authority, position, rank. I don't care. Does that give anyone to claim that they carry the voice of God and they know it and they're superior to other human beings? No one is superior to anyone among human beings. To me, the circle is a beautiful shape. I like it. I use it in my writing. Why do I like the circle? Because when you look at a circle, maybe in a mystical way, along the circle, every point is at equal distance to the center, right? I don't like hierarchies. I don't like discrimination. So anyone who claims that they represent the voice of God would be reflecting their own arrogance, I think.
At this very moment, populism, hard nationalism, authoritarian regimes are very present. In order to preserve a certain type of interior comfort, and you were talking about this, people tend to prefer authoritarian leaders. You come from Turkey. You live in London. You know lots of things on your own skin about what an authoritarian regime means. What would you tell to your fellow compatriots? What would you tell to my fellow compatriots about what interior comfort is when it's assured by a person who says, as you said, I'm going to help you. I'm going to take you out of this situation. Just follow me. What will you tell them directly as a citizen, as a human being, as a person?
I would say that democracy is not a perfect system, but it is a system worth improving. It is the best system that as humanity we have come up with. And I also believe that democracy is a much more fragile, delicate ecosystem of checks and balances. We need to nurture it. It's an ecosystem. We need to be engaged as citizens, rather than expecting some so-called strong man to save us. I am more interested in what we can do as citizens, because real change always comes from the society. Real change always comes from bottom up, rather than being imposed by a single person. So in that regard, I want to talk about equality. I want to talk about a society in which there is inclusion. Everyone is treated fairly and equally, just in a just way. There might be some societies that look strong from outside, and there's too much pressure, no freedom of speech, but those societies are unhappy societies. And with unhappiness, sooner or later, things change. We have enough information. When we look at history, we've seen so many cases of that. Happier societies are societies in which everyone can have a fair say. Everyone can feel welcome, no matter the color of their skin or their sexual identity or their political views. So I'm interested in coexistence. I am interested in pluralistic democracy, representative democracy in which people feel like their voices are heard. And this is important because we're living in an age in which, even though the social media seems to give everyone a voice, in fact, millions and millions of people feel like they are voiceless. So I would rather live in a democracy, improve our democracies, and defend democracies. And if I may say this, especially we women need to defend democracy much more passionately. Why? Because when countries go backwards, as we have seen in America, I'm not talking about the East only, the very first rights that will be curbed, taken away, will be women's rights and minority rights. So women and minorities, we should be more engaged and believe in democracy, and also work harder to improve what is broken.
Talking about the devil's advocate, what would you answer if someone will tell you something like this? Literature and emotion are talking through your mouth. The reality contradicts you. Different people cannot live together. Just look around and you'll see. What will you answer to that?
Reality is what we make of it, right? We make reality through our own perceptions, through our own filters. If you want to see conflict and clash between different tribes, you can find lots of examples. If you want to see examples of coexistence, that too you can find. And that's the complexity of humanity. we are capable of producing the worst atrocities in the name of nationalism, tribalism, isolationism. And we as humanity have also been capable of creating environments, societies in which people of all colors and of all backgrounds have been able to communicate, to understand each other, and to live in harmony. There are both examples because humanity has both sides. So the question is, where do you want to invest your efforts? Where do you want to invest your time, your work? Do you want to put your efforts into that kind of hostility, antagonism, clash? Or do you want to put your efforts into building bridges instead of walls? I personally want to build bridges. I find that world a much healthier world. Also, coming from Anatolia, coming from the Balkans, we know better than many people in some other parts of the world where nationalism, ultranationalism, tribalism is capable of taking us. And do we want to go down that dark tunnel again and again?
Elif Shafak, would you agree if I tell you that there's a whole industry, a professional industry, talking in good terms about humanity, an industry talking about good people, about good essences in people, about a better world, but it's an industry. Do you ever feel that you're a part of that industry?
No, I do not see myself like that at all. I am an individual, I am a storyteller. And trust me, it is not easy to be a storyteller from a country like Turkey. It is not easy to be a women writer from a country like Turkey. You have to deal with so much. And the only way you can do this year after year is if you really love, if you passionately feel attached to literature. There is no other way, So when I am writing a novel, when I'm in the middle of fiction, that is my reality, that is my world. I sense freedom there. I can be multiple there. And also with regards to what human beings are like, pessimism, extreme pessimism and extreme cynicism can be very easy, especially as you move. Sometimes I jokingly think, if you open a map of Europe and you look at the river Danube, if you trace the blue Danube with your finger, as you move from Germany towards the Black Sea, the level of optimism drops, right? So we are more pessimistic cultures. Understandably, we have complicated histories. But sometimes extreme pessimism or cynicism are the easiest things to do. And then the opposite, extreme optimism, can also be very misleading, as we have seen in early 2000s. You will remember back then there was so much optimism. People thought, thanks to digital technologies, we're all going to become a democracy. China is going to become a democracy. If Facebook enters the Middle East, of course the Middle East is going to become a democracy. And all of that, extreme confidence of early 2000s is now shattered to pieces. So where are we right now? Not extreme optimism, not extreme pessimism either. I like a combination. And the Italian thinker, political thinker, Gramsci used to talk about that. He used to talk about the pessimism of the intellect, but the optimism of the will, the optimism of the heart. And I think we live in an age in which we need both. Let the mind be a bit more of a pessimist. And believe me, I'm no stranger to that, I am from this part of the world, this side of the blue Danube. So pessimism is easier for me. But let the heart be more of an optimist. And for that, we need to connect with our fellow human beings. When we do that, we will feel a bit more hopeful, a bit more optimistic. But eventually what we need is a healthy combination of both pessimism. I call that creative pessimism and conscious optimism.
Which leads me to my next question. You personally are a part of a society which broke the bridge. I mean, England is out of Europe. You're a part of that society. How do you feel?
Yeah, it's very sad for me. I mean, I moved to this country about 12 years ago now. And over the years, I have seen things change. And one of the things that changed the most is the political language. The language of politics became more divisive, more emotionally charged. When I first moved to the UK, I used to think the British people, when they talk about politics, they're so calm. You know, that's so interesting. Coming from Turkey, it always amazed me. But I no longer think people are calm. People have become very divided. Brexit divided families. Brexit divided friendships. It affected the society and it broke so many things. I'm sad that the UK is going through Brexit. I would rather it had stayed within Europe and contributed to this, you know, multinational, multicultural unit, which is not easy, but it always can be improved further and further. So in that regard, I am very critical of the entire Brexit process. However, I'm also aware of the fact that while I criticize demagogues like Nigel Farage, who have been, you know, exploiting Brexit sentiments for their own benefits, in my opinion, I also know that I have a responsibility to connect with the people and understand why different people might have voted for Brexit. We can never belittle anyone just because they thought or voted differently. This is a very important thing for me. So we were talking about bridges, not only between East and West, but within our societies. We need to respect everyone and we need to listen a lot. We need to also express ourselves better. And there's lots of bridges that need to be built between regions and people who might be voting differently today.
You're a Turkish woman. How do you feel when you hear many times these words? The Turks are a danger to Europe. Turks are a danger to the civilized world. End of quotation. How do you feel when you hear that?
It breaks my heart. I feel so sad. But again, you see, nationalism always produces these sweeping generalizations about Turks, Arabs, you know, this community, that community. And how dangerous is that?
Because some people can understand that if you criticize the actual Turkish regime, you criticize the Turks.
But this is why we need to make a difference between governments and the people. This is so important. I think we should be very critical of governments who violate human rights, of governments who violate freedom of speech, of governments that are becoming more and more authoritarian. We should not mince our words when it comes to people in authority, you know, but never make the mistake of thinking that the government and the people are the same thing, because they're not. And when you go to Turkey, you will see so many people. They're so open-minded. There are many people who are open-minded. There are many people who want a proper democracy. There are many people who want to be global citizens or want to be better connected with the rest of the world. They're also there. Maybe we don't hear their voices. There are many Democrats in Turkey who feel very demoralized and very depressed. They also exist. But coming back to your question, it really breaks my heart when I hear these generalizations about where I come from, about Turks in particular. Just to give you an example, before Brexit referendum, there were signs in the UK, a few of billboards saying Turkey is joining the EU, 80 million of them, so it's time for us to leave. And that was incredibly sad for me to see, because first of all, it's a lie. This billboard was put up at a time when the relations between Turkey and EU were at their lowest level. Turkey is not joining the EU anytime soon. Anybody can see that. And even hopefully one day it joins the EU, in my opinion, the movement of people and labor can always be controlled, negotiated, and the UK had a big say in that. But the people, the populists who put up those billboards, they weren't interested in truth. They only wanted to create this element, stoke fear, elements of fear, as if there are barbarians at the gates and they're crashing the gates.
Oh, yeah.
80 million of them, so we better run away. That is very problematic. And it's also false.
How are you in this pandemic world? And I do not refer to the writer, to the essayist, to the academic, to the activist. I'm referring to you. How are you in this pandemic world?
Like everyone else, I'm affected by everything that is happening. Some days I find myself dealing more heavily with anxiety, worries as to the future, not only in political terms, but the future of our planet. We're talking We're having this interview in a moment when our planet is burning, when we have a climate emergency, and yet you have to convince some people that climate emergency is happening. So that's where we are, let alone taking action together. There's a lot that needs to be, addressed. And as a writer, it's not easy. Sometimes people think, well, writers, they wouldn't mind because they live in their own solitary world anyhow. They don't work in offices. They are alone in their houses. We are working in small spaces. So it's not much of a difference for them. That's not my experience. And I believe many writers are questioning themselves right now, as we should be. So sometimes you ask yourself, is this what I should be writing right now? Does it really matter if I find the perfect synonym? If I move that comma from this sentence to the next sentence, when people are dying outside in thousands, when there's so much hurt in the world, and when the climate emergency is so imminent. So you ask yourself, what am I doing? Am I contributing? Is this the book that I should be writing right now? And yet, I also believe with all those doubts and emotional turbulences, this is what makes us human.
Thank you so much. With your kind permission, I will say a few words in Romanian and I'll come back to you. Așa cum spuneam și la începutul întâlnirii noastre, cărțile autoarei Elif Shafak sunt publicate în limba română la editura Polirom, dar nu uit să mulțumesc încă o dată Institutului Cultural Român de la Londra pentru mijlocirea acestei întâlniri. Elif Shafak, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Looking forward to having you as a guest in person, flesh and blood, in Romania.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really look forward to coming to Romania and speaking again about literature, books, and all the things that means a lot to our hearts.
Thank you. Tuturor celor care sunt alături de Garantat 100%, mulțumim frumos pentru încredere. Ne vedem săptămâna viitoare. Noapte bună!